What if I told you that many of the economic challenges the UK faces today can be traced back decades to decisions that were praised at the time as necessary reforms? Before you jump to conclusions, stay with me, because this is not about blame. It's about understanding cause and effect in economic policy. If you want more breakdowns like this, clear, practical, and grounded in real financial thinking, take a second to like this video and subscribe. Now let's go back for context. The UK in the 1970s was not a strong, stable economy. It was struggling with high inflation, weak growth, frequent labor strikes, and declining global competitiveness. Industries were losing efficiency, and the country faced serious structural problems. This is important because it sets the stage. When Margaret Thatcher came into power in 1979, she wasn't stepping into a healthy system. She inherited an economy many believed needed radical change. And that's exactly what she brought: radical, market-driven reform. Her approach was built around a simple idea: reduce government control, increase market efficiency, and control inflation, even if it required short-term pain. Now here's where things get interesting. At the time, these policies were seen by supporters as necessary corrections. Inflation did come down, certain sectors became more competitive, and the UK began shifting toward a more finance-driven economy. But economic policy doesn't just have immediate effects. It creates long-term structures. And those structures can produce unintended consequences years, even decades later. So the real question isn't whether Thatcher's policies worked in the short term. The real question is, what kind of economy did those policies build over time? Because once you understand that, you begin to see how decisions made in one decade can shape economic outcomes for generations. To understand why Thatcher's policies had such a lasting impact, you have to look closely at the economic philosophy that guided them, something known as monetarism. At its core, monetarism focused on controlling inflation by managing the supply of money in the economy. The belief was straightforward. Inflation wasn't just a symptom, it was the central problem. If you could control it, you could stabilize everything else. And in theory, that makes sense. But the way this policy was implemented had real consequences. Interest rates were pushed higher to reduce spending and slow inflation. Government spending was tightened. State support for struggling industries was reduced. The goal was to force the economy to become more efficient by letting weaker parts of it contract. Now, from a purely economic perspective, this approach prioritizes long-term stability over short-term comfort. But in practice, that short-term impact was significant. Many traditional industries, especially manufacturing, were already under pressure from global competition. When support was withdrawn and borrowing became more expensive, a large number of these businesses couldn't survive the adjustment. Factories closed, industrial output declined. Entire regions that depended on these industries began to lose their economic base. This wasn't an accident. It was part of a broader shift. The idea was that the economy would rebalance toward more productive sectors over time. And in some ways, it did. Financial services began to grow. Certain areas of the economy became more competitive. But here's the key issue. The transition wasn't even. New opportunities didn't always appear in the same places where old industries disappeared. That created regional imbalances that still exist today. So while inflation control was achieved, the cost was structural change that reshaped the economy in a very uneven way. And once those structures were in place, they didn't simply reverse when conditions improved. They became the foundation for how the UK economy would function going forward. One of the most significant consequences of this economic shift was the rapid decline of manufacturing in the UK. This wasn't just a statistic on a chart. It represented a fundamental change in how the country produced value. For much of the 20th century, manufacturing had been a core part of the UK economy. It provided stable employment, supported entire communities, and created a broad base of middle-income jobs. But during the 1980s, global competition intensified. Production became more international. Countries with lower labor costs began to capture larger shares of manufacturing output. At the same time, domestic policy changes made certain industries less protected from these global pressures. When you combine global competition with higher borrowing costs and reduced state support, you create an environment where only the most efficient or adaptable firms survive. As a result, many factories closed. Industrial employment declined significantly. Entire towns that depended on manufacturing began to experience long-term economic decline. Now, it's important to be precise here. This wasn't simply caused by one policy decision. It was the result of multiple forces happening at the same time. Globalization, technological change, and domestic policy shifts reinforcing each other. But the outcome was clear. The UK economy became less manufacturing-driven and more service-driven over time. That shift had long-term implications. Manufacturing typically provides a wide distribution of jobs across skill levels. When it declines, economies often become more concentrated in sectors like finance, services, and technology. These sectors can be highly productive, but they don't always replace jobs at the same scale or in the same locations. So even as total economic output grew in certain areas, the benefits were not evenly distributed. This is where many long-term structural debates about inequality and regional disparity begin to take shape. Because once an economy shifts its foundation, it doesn't simply return to its previous structure. It adapts to the new one, and that adaptation creates winners and losers, not necessarily by design, but by economic momentum. Understanding this helps explain why certain regions of the UK still feel economically disconnected from national growth trends today. It's not just history. It's the long shadow of structural change. As manufacturing declined and the economy shifted, another major transformation was taking place at the same time, one that would redefine the UK's global economic identity. This was the rise of financial services and the deregulation of the financial sector, often associated with what became known as the Big Bang in 1986. The intention behind deregulation was to modernize London's financial markets, increase competitiveness, and attract global capital. Restrictions on trading, ownership structures, and financial operations were significantly reduced. And in many ways, it worked exactly as intended. London rapidly strengthened its position as one of the world's leading financial centers. Capital flowed in, banks expanded, financial innovation increased. The City of London became a major driver of national economic output. But here's where the deeper structural shift becomes important. When an economy becomes more reliant on financial services, its growth dynamics change. Financial sectors tend to generate high productivity and high wages, but they are also more concentrated geographically and require specialized skill sets. This can reduce the broad-based distribution of economic opportunity that manufacturing once provided. So while overall national wealth increased, the way that wealth was created and distributed began to shift. At the same time, other reforms like privatization were reshaping the role of the state in the economy. Public assets such as utilities and industries were transferred into private ownership with the goal of improving efficiency and reducing government debt. Supporters argue that this increased competitiveness and reduced fiscal burden. Critics argue that it reduced long-term public control over essential infrastructure. Both perspectives exist, and both reflect real trade-offs in economic policy. What is clear, however, is that these combined reforms fundamentally changed the structure of the UK economy. It became more market-oriented, more globally integrated, and more dependent on financial sectors than in previous decades. And once again, these changes were not temporary adjustments. They became embedded into how the economy operates on a structural level, which means their effects continue to influence outcomes long after the original policies were introduced. To understand the long-term impact of these economic shifts, it's important to look at what happens when an economy becomes more concentrated in certain sectors while others decline. Because economies are not just numbers on a spreadsheet. They are systems of employment, investment, productivity, and regional balance. When manufacturing declined and financial services expanded, the UK did not simply lose one sector and gain another in a perfectly balanced way. Instead, the structure of opportunity changed. Financial services, by nature, tend to be highly productive, but also highly centralized. They cluster in specific cities where capital, talent, and institutions already exist. In the UK, this meant a stronger concentration of economic power in London and the Southeast. At the same time, regions that had relied on industrial employment did not automatically transition into equivalent service-based opportunities at the same scale or speed. This created what economists often refer to as structural divergence, where different parts of the same economy begin to experience growth in very different ways. Now, it's important to be careful here. This doesn't mean one sector is bad and another is good. It means they function differently in terms of job creation, regional distribution, and long-term stability. Another factor that reinforced these changes was globalization. As trade barriers fell and global supply chains expanded, production became more internationally distributed. This made it harder for traditional domestic manufacturing to compete, but it also increased efficiency and lowered costs for consumers. So again, we see trade-offs. Lower prices and higher efficiency on one side, reduced industrial employment in certain regions on the other. Over time, these combined forces contributed to a UK economy that is highly service-oriented, globally connected, and financially strong in certain sectors, but also more uneven in regional economic outcomes. And this is where historical perspective becomes important. Because when people ask whether these outcomes were caused by one leader or one moment in time, they are often oversimplifying a much more complex process. Economic systems evolve through layers of decisions, global pressures, and long-term structural feedback. Once those layers build up, they become the environment future generations operate in, which means the present economy is not just the result of recent policy, it is the accumulation of decades of structural change. When you step back and look at the full arc of the UK economy from the 1970s through the Thatcher era and beyond, one thing becomes clear very quickly. What looks like a single turning point is actually a long chain of structural decisions interacting with global forces. It's easy to compress history into a simple story of before and after, but economies don't operate in clean breaks. They evolve through layers that build on each other over time. The reforms of the 1980s fundamentally shifted the UK toward a more market-driven system. Inflation was brought under control, financial markets were modernized, and global competitiveness in certain sectors increased significantly. These outcomes are widely acknowledged, even among economists who disagree on other aspects of the policy direction. At the same time, the economy became more concentrated in services and finance, while manufacturing continued its long-term decline under global competitive pressure. This shift created higher productivity in some areas, but also more uneven regional development. Now, it's important to understand what this means in practical terms. Economic transformation is rarely about simple gain or loss. It is about trade-offs between efficiency, stability, employment structure, and distribution. A system that becomes more efficient in allocating capital can also become less balanced in distributing opportunity. A system that becomes more globally competitive can also become more exposed to global cycles. These tensions are not unique to the UK. They appear in almost every advanced economy that undergoes structural modernization. So when people debate Thatcher's legacy, they are often debating different dimensions of the same transformation. Some focus on inflation control and market efficiency. Others focus on industrial decline and regional inequality. Both perspectives are grounded in real outcomes, but they emphasize different parts of the same economic evolution. And this is where the most important insight comes in. Long-term economic outcomes are not determined by one policy alone. They are shaped by how policies interact with global forces, technological change, and the structure of existing industries. Once those forces combine, they create momentum, and that momentum is very difficult to reverse, even decades later. So rather than viewing history as a simple verdict of success or failure, it's more accurate and more useful to see it as a sequence of structural choices that shape the environment we still operate in today. And if there is one lesson to take from this entire story, it's this. Economic systems are not static. They are constantly being reshaped, and the decisions made in one era often become the constraints and opportunities of the next. understanding that doesn't just change how you see history. It changes how you understand the present economy as well.